to have you with us, Mr. Felton.
Thank you very much. Call me Jack.
Okay, all right, Jack. Why don't we start with the early years, okay? Go back as far as graduation from the University of Michigan, which was in 1951. Then you got a master's in 52. And then you entered the Air Force and became first lieutenant of the Air Force Strategic Air Command during the Korean War. Now, talk about your career path then and how you transitioned from the Korean War and the military to public relations with U.S. Steel and Interstate Brands.
I'd be happy to. If you go back to that time period, the Korean War is on. So I finished a master's, needed to do military service, went in the Air Force and waited to go through OCS. And when I finished OCS, they assigned me to Strategic Air Command, which was I think the most active, exciting part of the Air Force anyway. And we were stationed in Spokane, Washington. I was sitting in my office, brand new on base, and the Master Sergeant came down and said, "Lieutenant, the General wants to see you right away." And I thought, I'm going to get canned the first day I'm here. So I made sure my uniform looked at least a little better pressed and walked in and saluted and sat down. He said, "Sit down, Lieutenant. I've got a problem." And I thought, you called me in to tell me you had a problem. He said, "I have the best officers in the Air Force, the most talented bombers, the most talented of all the talent." And he said, "I can't get them promoted because they're not very good at writing reports of how they perform." And he said, "See these?" And I said, "Yes." He says, "Those are officers' effectiveness reports." And I said, "Yes, I know about those." And he said, "Well, I want you to take these, go back to the reporting officer, and sit down with him, interview him, and find out what he really wants to say about the candidate. And then write it in English, good grammar, spelling." He said, "I understand you can write." And I said, "Well, yes, but I don't think I've done many officers' effectiveness reports, but we'll try." So I did that, and got to meet a lot of people on the base, because when you're working for the General right away, you get through open doors. Took them back to him and said, "Sir, I think these are good, and these are what the officers want to say." And I didn't know he had a sense of humor, but he kind of grimly said, "We'll see, Lieutenant." About 3 weeks later, the Master Sergeant said, "Lieutenant, the General wants to see you in his office right this very minute." And I thought, ooh. So I got there, and the General again, grim face, said, "Sit down, Lieutenant." He said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Every single report you rewrote got promoted. You now have a permanent job with me, and you're going to write any GD thing I want you to write. Do you understand?" And I said, "Yes, sir." So I started the Air Force career in a wonderful position. I've been lucky to be right place, right time most of my career. And I wrote his speeches, even did his correspondence. And when you have a chance that soon in your career to work with a top leader, you learn things that it would have taken years in a corporation to learn. When I got out of the Air Force, it was 57, and jobs were easy to come by. So I was interviewing cross-country, coming back from the assignment in Spokane, and picked up some interesting leads and had some good offers. My parents were hoping that I'd stay on the East Coast. And by this time we had a little one-year-old grandson, and they liked to see him more often. So I interviewed in Pittsburgh with U.S. Steel on a Friday, and they said, "Can you be in New York on Tuesday morning? We want you to meet the people at the headquarters staff." And I said, "Sure, I'd be glad to." So I went back to my home in Roanoke, and then flew up on Monday to New York. And the biggest show on Broadway at that time was My Fair Lady. You couldn't get tickets. Sold out 6 months, people paying all kinds of dollars to get them. And so I thought, well, I want to see My Fair Lady. So I'm standing in line. It says sold out 6 months, standing room only. But there was a young lawyer in back of me. And I said, "You want to see this show?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Let's do what my father's done in New York lots of time. Let's watch the doorman, because the doorman that opened the limousines for people often had tickets. and often got them at the last minute. So I walked over and talked to him. I said, "Do you have tickets?" And he said, "Have a couple." And he said, "So what do you want for them?" And he said, $75. And that was a lot for a Broadway show. Was $10.80. And so I thought, well, that's too much. But we watched him. He didn't sell any tickets. Lights flashed for everybody to be inside. I walked over to him. I told the young lawyer, I said, "Get a $20 bill. We're going to see the show." Walked over, handed him a $20 bill. We sat 6-row center, critic seats for My Fair Lady. Next morning, I'm down at 71 Broadway, interview for U.S. Steel. And they're making small talk. "Well, when did you get to town, Jack?" "Last night." "What'd you do?" "Saw a show." "Well, what show did you see?" And I said, My Fair Lady. And they said, "You didn't even know you were coming to New York till Friday. How'd you get a ticket?" And then I told them the story. Interview was very brief. I think they thought some dumb kid from Virginia can walk into New York and operate that way. And then they said, "Would I mind starting in San Francisco?" So that's the beginning. It's a crazy way to get a job interview, but go to a Broadway show.
After U.S. Steel, you went on to Interstate Brands, correct? Tell us about that.
Interstate Brands. I was hard away from U.S. Steel because I'd been doing a lot of product publicity for U.S. Steel and loved that part of it. In those days, a lot of public relations was doing product publicity. And the CEO of Interstate Brands, which is Wonder Bread, Dolly Madison Cake, had just gotten the contract from King Features for the Peanuts characters, for the Charlie Brown show on television. And so they needed someone that could do that kind of background. And if you recall, at Michigan was one of the few schools in the early days that recognized television was going to be part of journalism. And we had the Detroit station right on campus. So as students, we got to do shows on television that a lot of people wouldn't have gotten to do any other place else. So that was intriguing as an opportunity. It was great fun. And Charlie Brown and Lucy, you can do all kinds of things with. And Snoopy can dream he's anything. So you can imagine what you can do with speeches and presentations if you can use the Peanuts characters.
Well, let's move on to McCormick. Okay?
All right.
Now, you began there in 1977, and you retired in 95.
Mm-hmm.
During that time, McCormick acquired a lot of international corporations, making them an exceptionally huge corporation with subsidiaries across the globe. How did you bridge the cultural gap that must have existed with each international acquisition so that any action you recommended resonated with that specific target audience?
That's a good point. And I think a lot of companies make the mistake of thinking, because this is the way we do it at McCormick, it's the best way to do it anywhere. And we easily could have made a mistake because we, for years, had bought spices and dealt with spice dealers all around, and we ended up with 85 locations around the world. So we were in many cultures and many things. The smart thing they did, and it's because they had a strong feel that the person on the job knows the best how to do the job. So we always kept a native of that culture in the lead position at every one of our subsidiaries overseas. The number 2 guy was someone from McCormick, well-trained in our policies on ethics, on our financial policies, how we do business, and so we had a strong number 2 person who took care of all McCormick interests. But by having the leader from that culture in that lead position, we never missed a holiday, and we didn't mess up on cultural things that can be so awkward, particularly when you're dealing with food, because that's a very cultural, sensitive area, and we didn't want to stub our toes with the wrong spice at the wrong time.
Now, you mentioned your ethics policy at McCormick. Now, I know they had a pretty extensive business ethics policy, and I think it's 13 pages in length. I don't know if it was that long when you were there, but was it in place when you were there, and did you ever take it down off the shelf when you were in a time of crisis?
It was off the shelf all the time because the founder of the company had a very strong beginning that if someone was going to eat something we were manufacturing, we had to be very sure that it was the best quality we could offer. It was clean, it was packaged properly, it was sold properly, that it was off the shelf when it should be. And we were careful to be sure that we labeled things clearly and properly so that it was easy for the consumer to understand. We had people who weren't used to reading labels or recipes read the recipes and the labels to make sure they made sense. And we had the same thing when we put the label into foreign languages. And we had a trouble with Canada and their French and France and their French. And we had to be very careful that we sent French-Canadian French because they got very insulted. They don't like the Parisian French. And the Parisian French think the Canadian French is archaic. And so we always had to be careful. We were communicating in the right language culturally, which I think makes a big difference. Some companies don't do that. The ethics policy was part of at the end of an annual report, I had a page and I thought, why don't we just state what we believe? And we'd always had a very, very strong belief in the person on the job. Sometimes is best able to say how to do that job if we'll just ask them. You know, we come in and say, think we're leaders because we say, now here's how to do this. Well, sometimes we come in and give them guidelines and say, here's what I think we're going to be operating with, and this is the parameters of what we can do. The job's your responsibility. Now, if you have a problem, come see me. If you need some help, come see me. Even if it's just an easy question, come see me. But I want you to see what you think is the best way. It turns people on like you can't believe, and they just do splendid if you let them have the chance to bring their own creativity to the job, and they do things you never expected people to do.
Right. That sense of ownership, yeah, it's important. What was your greatest challenge as Vice President of Corporate Communication in McCormick's?
The first one was a built-in assumption by the leadership of McCormick that because they were the leading Baltimore firm, they gave the most to the community, they were the big company in town. They thought everybody knew who they were, and we were. We're the largest spice industry. But I had to try to help them understand, with the financial community particularly, there are other McCormicks. There's McCormick Place in Chicago. There was a McCormick Place up in New England somewhere, up around here, I think, near Cape Cod, where they went bankrupt, and it was a McCormick name again. And I would get calls, hey, did your company just go bankrupt? And I said, no, that's a builder. And I even found a little firm down in Arkansas that made bourbon. And I actually bought some and sent it to some of our leaders saying, what do you think of this? Is this a new acquisition? And it was so bad they sent it back to me. But I thought, we've got to find a way for people to understand that McCormick is the McCormick Spice Firm. And I kept hearing in Baltimore, you can tell people that work at McCormick and Company, they're around spices so much they smell like vanilla and cinnamon and the spices. And I thought, we got to capture that some way. I thought, well, let's make the annual report smell. So I didn't ask anybody if we could do it. And we tried, and we put the oleo resin. Each spice and herb has an oil, and that's where the flavor is. And so we tried that on the slick pages of the annual report. It wouldn't dry. And I didn't think the financials would like figures that ran all over the page. And then we tried it on the cover in a lacquer thing we sprayed on. And that was great too, except that when it dried, you didn't get the smell. And we'd just about given up on trying to find a way. And one day I was using some really dark black ink, and we were doing certificates, and I was signing them. And somebody brought me a blotter, and I thought, that's it. So we took uncoated paper that was recycled and used that for the financial pages. And after we'd printed them, we ran them through the printing press one more time with this oleo resin that looks like honey. It absorbs into the paper. And then the rest of the annual report was slick paper, good for photographs and so on. And so I took the first copy into the chairman, Harry, And I said, Harry, here's the first copy of the annual report. What do you think? He said, smells like cinnamon. I said, yeah, it's supposed to. And he said, what? I said, yeah. So he called me the next morning. He said, Jack, I took that annual report home, left it in the limousine. When I got in this morning, the whole car smelled like cinnamon. I said, that's the point, that's the point. And so we got tremendous press about an annual report that really smells. The headlines were in Business Week and all kinds of places. And a friend at Hallmark called and said, Jack, an annual report that smells like spice is just terrific. What a great idea for a spice company. He said, I left mine on the coffee table, and the dog ate it. He said, will it hurt the dog? And I said, no, it won't hurt the dog. Matter of fact, spices are used often in zoos and with animals that don't eat proper things. And spices are used to get them to eat good, nutritious food. So it won't hurt the dog at all. And a guy from Merrill Lynch called and said, Felton, you son of a gun. And I said, what have I done? He said, I can't get anything done today. And I said, why? What's the problem? He said, everybody's sniffing your GD annual report. So, and every year since then, the annual report smelled like a different spice. And at last count, we had about 152 spices in the spice line, so we won't run out soon. And it's fun. The Baltimore Sun runs a pocket change poll. They put money in from the pocket as to which one can name which spice it is. And we take the first annual report when they come out down to them, and they all see whoever gets the right smell for the right spice gets the little pocket of change, but it still gets great attention. It was fun. But that was a challenge, and we met it that way.
What was your greatest accomplishment with the film?
Well, I think the first answer would be hiring some very, very talented people who had great creativity, had a lovely staff, and again, giving them the guidelines and turning them loose and saying, come on, let's see what we can do with this together within the guidelines of proper procedures and everything they have to do. And one of them came in one day and said, Jack, what about a TV show for McCormick? This was long before anyone was using videotape at a company. And I said, well, that sounds great, but it's so expensive. How are we going to do it? And he said, have a young friend who wants to get started in making video things. And he said, he's willing to do it for, peanuts, just to get started. And I said, okay, let's, write the show. Let's get a wrap and do it. We call it McCormick News Wrap. And we used 2 employees, very attractive young people, and they told you the latest news like a newscast. And we used slides, since our people travel all over the world. We have beautiful slides of everywhere. So we could tell them everywhere new things were happening throughout the company. And we discovered that a 12-minute video like that was wonderful to send to all of our managers to let everybody know what was happening new, and we'd include the CEO and a number of officers in it, which they loved it. And the first time we showed it to people, again, I hadn't said, can we do this? They said, Jack, this is great. And the CEO loved the idea. But they couldn't believe that we had brought it in under such a nice budget thing. And I said, well, it's not going to stay this kind of a cost, because as we expand it, it's going to be more. But I know that if I had gone to them and said, hey, I want to start doing a TV show about McCormick, they probably would have said, we don't have money for that, Jack. We've got other kind of communications. But by doing it, showing them the effectiveness of it, then I could get away with it. So I was a bit of a rascal sometimes, but I seemed to get away with it lots of times. The other big challenge was a takeover attempt by a very wealthy, very huge pharmaceutical firm named Sandoz. And they came after us in a cheating, sort of nasty way, buying stock and as much as they could before they had to expose. And we finally caught them in the act and then began to do some investigation. Found out that they had bought King Fairy seeds, and you couldn't find seeds on the shelf anymore. They weren't good at marketing in America. And they had bought Ovaltine. You remember Ovaltine when you were a child? And you couldn't, no one had ever heard of Ovaltine in the current generation because it had disappeared also. So we knew we were dealing with someone who wanted us for money in the investment kind of things rather than for anything good for our employees or for the company. So we were engaged in a knockdown, drag-out, pretty tough fight. In one of the sessions, we'd been sitting around with the outside advisors that we brought in from New York, the lawyers and the investment bankers, and they'd been for days telling us what we couldn't do, and we'd say, well, how about this? No, you can't do that. You can't. And finally, I went to Harry, the CEO, and said, Harry, you know, I'm tired of hearing what we can't do. I need some quotes for the Wall Street Journal. I've got some friends that we have to get some statements out. And I said, we just can't sit around day after day with these high-priced talent telling us what we can't do. And if it's okay with you tomorrow, because you can't really very well do it, I'm going to stand up right in the middle of the meeting and said, hey, wait a minute. I want to know what we can do. And he said, great, Jack, do it. And I went to the treasurer and did the same thing. He was a friend. So that next day, we went in. They were doing the same thing. The chairman's sitting at one end of the table, the treasurer at the other. I'm in the middle. And they start, no, I can't do that, I can't do that, you know. And I'm putting gloves on underneath the table. They don't know. And they think they've convinced us or something. And I stand up and throw the gloves down the table and said, look, gentlemen, I'm ready to fight. And we've got to get something going here. And I have to have a quote for the Wall Street Journal. And that did it. And we got started. And when my friend at the Wall Street Journal said, well, Jack, what do you think Sandoz is going to do when you folks tell him no, that you just don't want any part of this? I said, well, why don't you ask them? So he did. And the Swiss had a spokesman named Dr. Donat. And Dr. Donat did what typical Swiss German type people did, sort of braced himself and said, well, we'll take them over anyway. And that just blew the whole thing wide open. Even the Sandoz people in the States said, Jack, we apologize. That's not the way. It messed the whole thing. But it did reveal their... So we then tried to embarrass them as much as we could with finding out they were moving inventories from different country to country in Europe to avoid taxes, and that they'd polluted some rivers in Switzerland and done some really bad stuff. And finally had to have a meeting with them. And so they announced from New York they were going to fly to New York and come down by train, Amtrak, to Baltimore. And I went into Harry and I said, Harry, I have an idea. And he said, what? I said, why don't we pick them up in your limousine? And Harry said, I'm not going to put those in my limousine. And I said, wait a minute, Harry, let's talk a minute. I said, we can't tape record in Maryland. It's illegal to tape record conversations. But I said, if we had a Swiss-German driver, he might be able to listen to some of their strategies because they've been playing so many dirty games with us. We might as well see what good information we can get, and that's certainly legitimate. They're in our car, and if they're not smart enough not to talk in our car, that's their problem. And he said, that's a good idea, I'll do it. And then I said, also, the PR firm that's handling them in New York has announced and already called the Baltimore press to tell them that they're going to have a big press conference right after the meeting at our headquarters. And Harry looked at me kind of funny, and I said, well, see, they didn't bother to call us to see if we'd have a joint. They didn't even do the courtesy to have a joint thing. I said, Harry, why don't we, instead of having the meeting, you're going to be driving them, instead of having the meeting at corporate headquarters, why don't we drive them down to McCormick Properties headquarters? It says McCormick Properties. They have a very nice boardroom. Why don't we have the meeting there? And we did. And we had practiced with Harry saying no, no, 1,000 times no in Swiss German right away. And they came out very unhappy and looked around, and there was no press. And they sort of grumbled and got back in the car and got back in the limousine. And meanwhile, the press, the Baltimore press, was up by our normal headquarters. And that's why you have to be very careful. A good lesson for people. Don't assume without checking what's going to happen. And we, fortunately, were able to keep them from making all kinds of promises that we knew they probably wouldn't keep to our employees. And the Baltimore press, when they said, well, Jack, why didn't you tell us? I said, they called you. I didn't call a press conference. It was not my responsibility to tell you where they were having their press conference. If they're not smart enough to tell you where they're having their press conference, that's their problem. And we won. We ended up, they backed away completely and we bought back the stock. But it was a very tough time. And at the end of it, I said, Harry, you know, it had some moments, and it had some moments of fun when we could outwit them and outdo them. But I said, let's don't do this one again.
Did the Swiss-German driver, was he able, or he or she able to obtain any information?
No, they talked small talk about Baltimore, and going back, the conversation was all about how mad they were that the press didn't show up. They couldn't imagine they were giving the poor press guy from New York a bad time about, well, I thought you said you were going to have the Baltimore press. I didn't see any press there, and giving them which I laughed over.
Who had the most significant influence on your career, and why?
I think Art McQuitty, who was my first real boss at U.S. Steel, and we were in Salt Lake City, and having grown up in Virginia and being very much an Easterner, I got off the plane in a Brooks Brothers suit with a vest and a striped tie and a hat in those days. And the first thing he said to me, Jack, off with the vest, off with the Brooks Brothers suit. You're in the Cowboy West. You've got to learn to dress the way we dress out here. Which I thought, oh, that's strange. You know, it's still the same corporation. But I learned from him so many things about how to do product publicity, how to deal with people and communities. And in Salt Lake, I was a minority for the first time, because it's all 68% LDS Mormon church. I'm a whiskey-drinking Presbyterian, and so I would say, look, I'm a whiskey-drinking Presbyterian. If that's a problem, it's your problem, not mine. But we had a wonderful relationship and great cooperation with all kinds of things. And it was a new experience and a completely new environment for me. And he led me through that, and then stayed with me my whole career. I could call him and I'd say, Uncle Art, what's this? And we were just in Las Vegas 3 weeks ago celebrating his 90th birthday. And he has a ranch in New Mexico, and his daughter had his 90th birthday party in Las Vegas because it's easy for people to get to. And he thought it was just going to be a small group, and all of us descended from, and he had a wonderful time. It was a great time, but he was the real great influence about do things right, check, be sure, check, don't assume, and all the things you really need to know when you're young in a career. But he was a terrific guy, and great sense of humor, great sense of humor.
Let's talk about consumerism.
All right.
Okay. Now, it came out of the conflict of the 1960s, first as an advertising term, but now as a legitimate concept that's been, that public relations practitioners deal with every day. It's been 10 years since you wrote the chapter on consumer affairs and consumerism for Leslie's Handbook of PR and Communications.
It's more like 30 years. You're being very kind.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's more like 30 years. Consumer things has changed so much. So much more speed in communication. And the consumer, I think, knows more and has access to more information than ever before. And I think we have to be very careful, now that we've speeded up communications, to make sure the message is right, because when it goes so fast and you're doing so many things, you don't have the time to double check and do some of the kind of things we normally used to do when we had deadlines on a newspaper or deadlines on a television or radio show. Now it's instant everything, and I think consumers are more skeptical. They've been fooled. They've been scammed and spammed and all kinds of things. And I think we have to be very careful how we tailor messages for them so that they're tailored just for the consumer we want to do. At McCormick, we used to try to work on several levels. We worked on the mother who stayed at home and cooked meals that took a long time and used spices a different way. And then we developed all kinds of recipes and ideas for working mothers because they have less time. And then we began developing things for the older group of people who want the gourmet kind of food and will spend that kind of time with it. And you develop different messages very carefully because there's a big difference between stay-at-home mother, working father, or stay-at-home father, and how we do approach the selling of spices. It's different audiences. And I think too many times we think, one message suits all, and we used to do that lots of times, but we can't do that anymore. I think you have to be very careful to watch the integrity of all suppliers to make sure that they follow the same guidelines you do, because in the spice business, you're preparing things people are going to eat. And you have to be very careful about how it's packaged, how it's stored, how it's transported, how it gets to the shelf, and what part of the shelf it's on even. So it's a tougher role, I think. But we came through that consumerism period, I think, pretty well. For a while, we were over-regulating everything to the point that it was getting pretty ridiculous. But I think we've gotten through that. And I helped form the first Consumer Affairs Committee for PRSA because I thought we ought to get all these people there involved with this. It's evolved into what now is the corporate section. But for the early days, we were the consumer people trying to get people to tell the truth on labels. And
what do you think about the recent college graduates? Are they prepared for informed ethical decision-making, or do they need some more training?
I think any of the sequences students take in college in the field of public relations needs to have a very strong ethics course. And it needs to be taught by someone who has some pretty hard and fast ground rules about what's allowable and what isn't. We take great care and teach them the PR and the law so they don't get in trouble with that part of PR. And we teach them very carefully about how to do financial reporting because we don't want them to get in trouble doing that. But we lack, I think, lots of times the ethic question of, is this the right thing to do? Is this the right way to do it? Am I doing something good for bad reasons? Or am I doing something bad for good reasons? And I think we need to sort that out. I don't think children today get the same kind of parental teaching that maybe some of us got. And I think parents are busy and they assume the schools are going to teach good behavior and how to behave, and sometimes that doesn't happen. And so I think any course at any college that has a curriculum for public relations needs to have a very, very strong, that everyone has to take. And I think by having the students have that kind of a focus, we say to them, look, it's important in PR that we tell the truth, that we act it out, that we do the Arthur Page principles, because that's what it's about. And if the minute you lose the trust, you've just forgotten. And with consumers, with your shareholders, with your employees, if you lose the trust, you've just lost the battle, practically. It's so hard to get it back. And I think one way to do that and enforce that idea of keeping the trust is to say, look, here's what ethical behavior looks like, and you present them with some problems. Here's the problem. Would we do this? Would we do that? Which is the right way to go here? And it gets some interesting discussions in classroom because someone will say, but we can't make as big a profit that way. And I said, well, is big a profit more important than keeping a loyal customer? No. So I feel very strongly that. And one nice thing, I think we're seeing a lot more people do what I did, go back and teach. I felt I was giving back. I'd had such good training and such good mentors that I thought the least I can do is go back. And I was offered a semester as I love the title, Distinguished Visiting Professor. Oh, boy. For a semester at Florida. And I liked it so much, and the students seemed to enjoy me so much, that I stayed on for 10 years. I turned around and said, I couldn't believe I'd even been there 10 years. But, you learn from the students. And we're getting such bright, well-trained young people now. And Betsy Plank and others have worked so hard to get the young people trained. And I think we've got good programs in place at many, many schools. So I think we're going to have better PR people as a result. But I think it's good for old-timers who can go back and say, that theory's right, but here's the way you put it in. If you do it this way, the CEOs can cut your ears off. But if you do it this way, you can get it through and you can win. And I think that's what we need to go back and do and say, the theory's right, but here's how we make it work.
Let's talk a moment about counseling. The aim of the Arthur W. Page Center and the Page Society is to help individuals become counselors to leadership. How can individuals best prepare themselves for this role?
I think you have to have had some experience of some good counseling yourself and recognize what someone did for you so that you can take that same kind of care to someone else. I think we need to let students and people know we believe in them, that we think they have strong abilities, and that we are fair with them in saying, we think you're wonderful this way, but how about you better do a little bit better on writing a news release, or you might do better in doing a speech if we did it this way. And I think we have to assume that responsibility in trying to make students even better by working with them, being not a pal, but being someone they're comfortable to come back with and say, what am I going to do here? And you can help them. And you want them to ask the question and not be scared or worried about doing it. And I think we need to be open and available and with a sense of humor. You know, you can do so much more if you can laugh together, even if it's a problem. If you can make it enjoyable for everybody and fun to be around and fun to work with.
In 1985, you were asked about the value of licensing public relations practitioners. Now, PRSA's opinion at that time was really negative, but Ed Bernays fully supported that idea. So is it time now in 2008 to revisit this discussion on the value of licensing PR practitioners? And do you think it would make a difference in the perception of the profession by the average American citizen?
I think we tried hard with the accredited thing that PRSA has, and we found that a lot of people don't care enough or haven't cared enough to even go through taking those tests. We tried to make it a requirement, and that didn't work. I don't think licensing is necessarily the best way for us to go. You know, you go to a doctor's office, and he has a license. You go to a lawyer's office, they have a license, or she has a license on the wall. But you don't go back to them because they have a license on the wall. You go back because you have a one-on-one relationship with them. And in this business, everything's relationships. Relationships with your wife, your employee, your children, your comrades, and your friends. And I think just getting a license is not going to make the profession better. The only thing it might do is help us kick a few people out that shouldn't be in the profession. But I think we can expose enough of those by exposing their misbehavior enough to maybe get rid of them, make them uncomfortable enough. But I think licensing isn't going to do the trick nearly as well as building a relationship with people. I like to go to a doctor that I trust, that I believe in, that's going to tell me the truth. I want to go to a lawyer that's going to tell me what I should do and how to do it properly. I don't want to go to them because they have a license. And I don't think people are going to go to PR counselors or to teachers. I used to love the open door policy. My students would come in and they'd talk about all kinds of personal problems and everything, which I was glad they did, you know, and I could help them. They wanted to get into law school or they wanted to do some special grad work. And I was glad to help and talk with them about it. And I was glad they came to ask because I think they thought I would play fair, tell the truth, and work with them. and help them. And that's what this business is about. I think you earn your reputation, and that's in a corporation. I used to say, we're just a little communications department in the middle of a big, huge corporation. We're here to help everybody that has any kind of a communication problem come in. We'll do what we can to help you. And one day, a guy came in, and he said, Jack, I'm in the lowest level of marketing and sales in McCormick. We sell the spices to the people that make sausages and things like that. Not that there's anything wrong with them health-wise, but it just doesn't have to be top-quality gourmet. But he said, it's the tough part of the business. And he said, I don't have a budget, and I need to have a sales meeting. And I said, well, what are we doing? He said, well, you're already helping us with some advertising. One of your staff people is doing the ads for us, and it's called New Direction in Flavor. And I said, okay, let me see what we can do about it. So I called in the young lady that did my creative advertising, and we started kicking around ideas. And I said, New Directions in Flavor. I said, Diane, call the Maryland Highway Commission and see if we can't borrow some of their road signs. Detour, stop, red light, soft shoulder, yield, all those kind of signs. See if we can borrow some of their signs, and we'll use those to decorate the big ballroom where they're going to have the meeting. We won't have to pay any money for them. And we hung it up with the little kind of wire that you use in fishing, that's clear plastic. So you can, when you walked in that room, and she was a good enough sales lady that they gave her every new sign they had, including the actual traffic signs that linked on and off red and green. So the room looked marvelous by the time we got it decorated. And he came back afterwards and said it was the greatest sales meeting he'd ever had. And so I sent him a bill for $36 for the little things we've been hanging some. He said, Jack, I told you I didn't have any money. He was teasing back. Later on, he became president of the company. And guess what kind of relationship we had all through. So you need to remember the little guys and the little people that really need some help, and not be think you're such a big corporate executive that you don't have time to help people with their problems. But you can imagine what fun we had when he was president.
We're back to challenges and accomplishments again, but this time at IPR. What was your greatest accomplishment?
Again, I think hiring the right people. Michelle Henson was marvelous, and when I talked with her, I knew she was bright and talented and could do things. And so the two of us started out with a grand total of $18,000, and we now are raising almost $1 million in research. And then the next thing was to pick my successor, and I think Frank Oviatt has been marvelous. And he and Michelle have just taken it to all kinds of new things. We now have things we're doing in Europe, and we have cooperation with all of the PR agencies. And I think great respect for the kind of research that's being done. And it was needed, so badly needed. And but by having the right people and turning them loose with guidelines, you see what happens. And they've just done very, very well. So I'm very proud of what the literature that's been produced. We used to say you couldn't measure public relations. People don't say that anymore, because the Measurement Commission proved a way that we can measure what we do and show the CEO our effectiveness. And that all came out of getting the right people together and saying, hey, let's have at it. What can we do here? And I think we're now on a program to build a library of essential information, which will be free to everybody in the profession. And that essential library is going to be wonderful for people to plug in on all kinds of different categories of public relations, because each of us has almost a unique kind of public relations we do, depending upon the company or the organization we work for. But we have some essential knowledge. And if we can all get that same track, and I think professors at schools like Penn State and at Florida and other schools are going to be able to use that as a wonderful library too. And the fact that it's available free, I think it's just a wonderful asset for the Institute. So I'm very proud of what has happened there and what Michelle and Frank Oviatt and the board of directors have done. It's terrific.
Well, what about a challenge? Can you think of a particular challenge that you had at the Institute for Public Relations?
Well, first of all, with $12,000, the challenge was, can we keep it going long enough till we can get something? And by getting people to come to Florida, we started doing some symposia on different topics. And we did one on international public relations. We did one on terror. But we were talking about the kind of terror where someone would put some kind of a liquid in the water supply. And we did one on, in Rome, do we do PR as the Romans do, or do we do it, which is a big ethic problem. And then we did one on measurement. So those began to get a reputation for us. People came to the campus at Florida and participated. And those were some of the first papers that we did. And they began to get the news out that what we were about, what we were trying to do, and it just built. And soon we were what we are today and going for new things in Europe right now.
Let's talk about an article that you wrote in 1995 that was called A Generation of Attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about the importance of tuning messages, which you've mentioned as we've talked, tuning those messages to a receiver's attitude. And you had talked about it in McCormick, walking into that room and realizing, looking at those individuals and realizing the attitude that they have that was so different from where you were at the time. So it's 2008 now, and of course the attitudes are constantly changing. So do the same problems that you faced at McCormick in the 70s, that disconnect, is that still something that current communicators need to be aware of and work with?
We still have lots of disconnects, and I think because we can communicate so many more and many different ways, we have even more disconnects that we have to try to put together. That study comes from a research paper that says by the time we're 21, we've pretty well formed a list of what we believe ethically, what our religion's going to be, what our attitude about work, and what our political ideas are going to be. And that's pretty well formed. And this study takes the proposition that these attitudes stay pretty consistent through the years, some of them, but some of them don't. And if you look at where we started in, say, the 50s, where the employee said, hey, give me a job, I'll work anywhere, I'll do anything you want me to do, to today, where we've gone through the various me generations and the X's and the Y's and all of those, to now that the employee is saying, hey, you want me to work for you, then you better be loyal to me. You better, do something for me, and what's in it for me? And then we get to, hey, if you say that's true, prove it with how you act. And so we're a lot more demanding, I think. And I think younger generations expect more of companies. I think we're looking at a time when they're worried about what their financial situation is going to be with companies, what kind of retirement plans and those kind of things, much more than we used to. We used to think, hey, if you went to work for a big company, you knew they were going to take care of you and to take care of your health care and your financial benefits and all that kind of stuff. And nowadays, they have to ask those questions, and we have to make sure we can make the kind of connections and we have to understand that generation by generation, we keep some attitudes, but some other attitudes change. And we're not the same people we were in the 50s or the 60s. And I think that study, which I'd love to do a new update version on, to see really where we are today, because we've about run through the XYZ part.
We're in the
text.
millennials.
Text. I think we're in the text thing where everybody's text messaging to everybody. And I think that's a problem too, because when we do messages so fast without thinking about it carefully, we sometimes send the very wrong message that we don't intend to. And I think there's a danger in that speed up of things. We rip off a quick answer, and it's hard to know how it's received, because it might be the right answer, but the way it was done and the tone of it is terrible and sends the wrong message. So I think we have to watch those attitude carefully.
You've received many awards and honors, and can you identify one that is particularly important to you and explain why it's so important?
Well, I think the Arthur Page Award is the pinnacle award. I've had others, as you know. The Arthur Page is given to you by your peers in recognition of something they think you've done that's been innovative or new or different or made a difference in the profession. And I think when you get an Arthur Page Award, you have to say, wow, that's really something special to be proud of.
The Hamilton Award?
No, Hamilton Award is the Institute's award
That's the Institute.
for achievement. And then the Arthur Page gives one for achievement too, for career achievement. And that's, I think, they have an honor roll of people, and then they have one for achievement. And I got the one, happy to get one for achievement. But I think the top award's Arthur Page.
Is there anything else that you'd like to talk about? Anything else you want to share with the next generation?
One little last bit of advice. Be careful how creative you are and some of the creative ideas you do. We were sitting at U.S. Steel one day, and we had a new kind of steel we had to promote called Corten. And it was called Corten because it has a lot of copper in it. And it was designed for use in high bridges and high buildings that you can't get to paint very often. The copper in it, the steel forms a patina on the outside, a rusty looking, sort of paints itself. And what we were faced with, how are we going to get people to understand rusty steel is strong? So Smart Alex said, well, why don't we get a big animal like an elephant to stand on it? So guess who inherited that job? And I called Sarasota and said, hey, you've got a circus elephant. We need an elephant to stand on put 4 barrels down and then put steel plate on and have the elephant stand on it. Didn't have anything. And I thought, uh-oh. So then I thought, Hollywood. Got a person in Hollywood who had a trick, small elephant that could stand on 1 foot. And I thought that would be even more spectacular to have an elephant standing on 1 foot on this Corten to show how strong it was. So we sent the steel plate to LA, hired the photographer, had all the things ready. Get out there, and sure, here's the elephant and everything else. We get it all set up, get the elephant up on there. Elephant stands up, but they forgot to tell me that when this elephant stands up, this elephant wets. So suddenly we have a situation in a photograph that was not quite what we wanted. So we had to clean the steel off again, get the elephant back up, and the elephant. And one of the pictures in my den is me running like hell away from the elephant because we've got him up ready to get the photograph. We did it a number of times, but we finally got the photograph. And it turned out to be one that got picked up as a publicity thing everywhere, used in the ad campaign, used for all the marketing of the Corten. It was a huge success. But getting that photograph was not quite what we expected, but it was kind of fun.
I want to thank you very much for taking some time from a busy schedule. You could be playing golf or something right now. We appreciate sharing your thoughts.
Well, you're very kind, and I've always had fun telling my stories, and thank you for asking.